So welcome and good afternoon. I'm Michael Steinmacher. I'm the director of the library at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Today we are talking with Dwayne Epstein, the author of Killin Generals, the making of the Dirty Dozen, the most iconic World War II movie of all time. Dwayne is the author of the New York Times bestselling Lee Marvin, Point Blank, which was the first full-length biography of the actor. He's contributed to Film Facts magazine and written film reviews for Hearst community newspapers. Well, first of all, Dwayne, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be here.
So first of all, let's just get right to it. You
Okay.
subtitled the book, the Making of the Dirty Dozen, the most iconic World War II movie of all time. Can you tell us why it has that status in your mind?
Yeah, sure. Because basically, it was the first film of its kind to kind of break all the rules. Excuse me. Previous World War II movies had been very overly patriotic and gung ho, and let's all fight for the cause, or they were interesting character studies, fascinating character studies, and in some instances, they were out and out classics like Bridge on the River Kwai and others. But by the early '60s, that sense of gung ho was slowly fading, and war films were becoming more and more character studies, and the cynicism of the time of the mid to late '60s was kind of the perfect storm for a film like The Dirty Dozen, in which the characters were out and out criminals, and that had never been done before. Robert Aldridge, the film director, was the one who referred to it, the film's success, as a perfect storm, because of the political unrest in the country at the time, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the escalation of the war. It proved to be the film that was perfect for its time, and it has stood the test of time in that what it says about the military and authority still resonates to this day.
So many people may be surprised to know that the movie actually started as a book. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and its origins and historical connections?
Sure. It's interesting in that many people, and I've read this in impressive chronicles and history writers and what have you, that they believe it was based on a true story. That's one of the several urban legends that still exists about that movie. It doesn't. It wasn't, excuse me. It was not based on a true story. It was based more on what can probably be called a latrine rumor. The beginning of the story was a result of, where the story came from was a result of all people, Russ Meyer, the guy who made the sexploitation films in the '60s and '70s. He was a friend of the author, E.M. Nathanson, Mick Nathanson to his friends. And he told this story to Mick about when he was in the war. He was a combat photographer in World War II, and he took pictures of what were called the Dirty Dozen, which were 12 convicts being trained for a suicide mission overseas. And he took those photos and he turned them in. And about a month or two later, he went back to that same prison asking what happened to those gentlemen. And he was told they were all killed in the suicide mission. Then he wanted to find those photos he took, and he went to his superiors, and he went through this whole series of events, and nobody knows what happened to him. So Mick Nathanson was fascinated by the story. In fact, I even titled one of the chapters on his reaction. He called it "The Hackles on the Back of My Neck Stood Up," because he thought it was an amazing tale. And he did research on his own, and he decided to find out what Russ Meyer was talking about. And he researched for 2 years trying to find the so-called Dirty Dozen. Turns out they never existed. And so he decided, instead of writing a work of nonfiction, he decided to write a novel called The Dirty Dozen. And what he had done was the research he did by reading trial transcripts and going to the Pentagon archives and other military sources. He decided to use that as the basis for the book. And there it went. It went from there.
So the film was released in the summer of '67, just before strong protests were starting to take off over Vietnam in America. Films oftentimes hold a mirror up to society and allow us to both think about the past and the present. Do you think The Dirty Dozen was trying to make a point in its day or encouraging some sort of introspective review?
I'm sorry. Ask me that question again.
Sure. You know, films oftentimes hold up a mirror to society. And I'm wondering if you think The Dirty Dozen was trying to make a point or encouraging some sort of introspective review at the time.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes, they did. Um, the gentleman who directed it, as I mentioned a moment ago, Robert Aldrich, he historically was very liberal politically and philosophically. He came from wealth. His cousin was Nelson Rockefeller. His parents in Rhode Island ran several banking institutes, and he rebelled against that. He hated everything they stood for. So consequently, as a young man, he got into the film business at the bottom rung. I think it was like in the mailroom. And he slowly worked his way up to eventually becoming a director. And he trained and mentored under the likes of Jean Renoir, Charlie Chaplin. Oh my gosh, so many truly great filmmakers. So he knew what he was doing by the time he got to direct the film. And consequently, he had something to say with his film. Now, he wasn't very beloved in the Hollywood community, which is why he never got an Oscar nomination. But he did have something to say. And what he was saying with The Dirty Dozen, there were several messages in that film, but one of them being very anti-authority. And to his mind, the way the military is portrayed in that film, especially by the commanding officers, they were very much establishment, and they were very much like a corporation. There's that great scene in the beginning of the movie where they're telling Lee Marvin what the mission is, and it plays very much like, you know, a board meeting of a corporation. Ernest Borgnine makes a stupid joke, and he looks around, and then everybody starts laughing just because he's looking at them, and they're kind of like, oh, yes, sir, right? That kind of thing. The only one who doesn't do that is Lee Marvin, of course, because he's a maverick, and he doesn't want to do any of the things they're forcing him to do. As he says himself, when Borgnine says, you're not exactly being asked to do this, and Marvin smiles and goes, I get it. I'm volunteering. And Borgnine goes, exactly. So, I mean, that's the point that Robert Aldrich was trying to make. And keep in mind, too, none of the dozen are doing what they're doing because they believe in the cause, that they hate Nazis and that kind of thing, which a lot of World War II movies did indeed do. They're doing what they're doing purely for redemption, for survival, to at a chance or a shot of amnesty, which is never really promised to them anyway. It's just a possibility of it. And that possibility is enough for them to try to get the mission accomplished. So that is kind of like Aldrich's point, his message. So, that among other points that were made in the movie, I don't know of a whole lot of World War II movies. There are a couple, of course, World War II movies that dealt with racism and off the top of my head, I can't think of some of the other issues, but it deals with a lot, especially for a gung-ho war film. And that's the interesting thing too about why it was so popular, was that if you're a hawk, the movie was great because it had a lot of great action scenes in it. At the time, some of the best. And if you're a dove, you liked it because the point was war is meaningless and it's a waste of human endeavor. And so consequently, it got, all kinds of people interested in the film.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the cast now, but I want to encourage people to put their questions in the chat. As I see questions, I'm going to be feeding them to Mr. Epstein, and we'll make this part of a bigger conversation. It's not just my questions, it's yours as well. So please put a question in the chat if you have something you want to ask. So we've talked about Lee Marvin a little bit, and I mentioned at the top you wrote the first full-length biography of Lee Marvin.
Yes, sir.
So tell me a little bit about why you think Lee Marvin was the right person to play John Reisman.
Well, it's interesting. He wasn't actually the first choice. He was film director Robert Aldrich's first choice, but Aldrich wasn't assigned to the project yet. The producer of the film was Ken Hyman, and whom I spoke to, by the way. He's still very much alive. He's in his 90s. He lives in England. Wonderful guy with a great memory for things. Hyman had approached John Wayne to play Reisman, who read the script and turned it down. And he turned it down with an interesting memo sent to Ken Hyman saying, whoever wrote this script is probably some long-haired, sandal-wearing young man with carrying a sign against the war. He should be fighting himself. That was his take on it. The truth of the matter was the screenplay he read was written by a 66-year-old Hollywood veteran, which was not exactly what John Wayne thought. In any event, because John Wayne had turned it down, and no director had been assigned yet, but Ken Hyman approached Robert Aldridge, and the script, and he liked it, but he thought some changes had to be made. And as far as the character of Reisman goes, he had very specific ideas about how and who Reisman should be played. And first and foremost on his list, by the way, and they approached Lee Marvin, who read the script and liked it. And that's all that, there was a lot of controversy about the end of the movie that the explosion of the chateau killed not only Nazis, but apparently maybe innocent people as well. The women who accompanied the Nazis. And of course, Lee Marvin was the one who made the point. I don't know how innocent a woman can be if they're hanging out with Nazis. And he also said in an interview, he goes, look, let's not kid ourselves. Innocent people die in war. It's a violent situation. He mentioned the bombing of Dresden and the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, that innocent people die in war. Always have, always will. It's just the nature of the beast. So he didn't have any problem with that as far as the story goes. And a real cute aside, when Lee Marvin was in the war during World War II, he never rose above the rank of private first class. He was a corporal, I think, for about a week, and then he got busted. But Ken Hyman was in the Marines during the war, and he was a corporal. And so when Lee Marvin was talking about the role with Ken Hyman, Hyman said, look, you were a private. I was a corporal. I'll pull rank on you if I have to, which I thought was cool.
That is cool. I noticed in the news within the last month that Cleveland Browns great Jim Brown passed away. And yes, of course, he plays Jefferson in The Dirty Dozen, which was one of his first film appearances.
It was actually, it was his second film.
Yes, exactly.
He had done a Western a year or two before called Rio Conchos.
Yes. He was the single African-American member of The Dirty Dozen. Indeed. Can you talk about his depiction in the film and more generally about how non-white characters are depicted?
Yeah, and by the way, just a quick aside, I was fascinated to find this out. He's actually not the only African-American in the film. There was an actor named Ben Carruthers who played the character of Glenn Gilpin, the guy who gets his foot stuck in the roof of the chateau. Okay, he is African-American, but he's also of Spanish blood, which made him rather a light-skinned African-American, and he was able to play all kinds of ethnic characters, even white guys. And I interviewed his son, Kane Carruthers, who had been a musician and did some other interesting things. And he told me, anytime he told anybody that his father was in The Dirty Dozen, they would say to him, wow, you're Jim Brown's son? And he would go, no, I'm not. Because he's a lot darker than his father was, and that happened. But anyway, Jim Brown's take on the film. I didn't get to interview Jim Brown because at the time I was working on it, he was in ill health, obviously. But he did write in his autobiography that he loved the character. He had read the book and loved the character in the book, and he loved playing the character on film, saying that he was a natural leader, his character. He had been an officer. And he just thought, this is the kind of part African Americans should play. And there wasn't a whole lot of choices like that at the time he was making the film. He could, Sidney Poitier apparently had been approached and turned it down. And Jim Brown, being Jim Brown, he wasn't a shrinking violet. He wrote in his autobiography that, Sidney opened a lot of doors for us, but he's always playing a nice guy. He never really played a super tough guy, a sexy guy. And he goes, that's where guys like me came in. And he also, I think, mentioned Fred Williamson as well. And they pretty much, here's an interesting thing. Almost to a person, everybody involved in that movie had their careers you know, take off like a rocket. And Jim Brown is a real good example of that. He literally helped create a whole new genre of film called blaxploitation that was extremely popular in the 70s. And everybody else in the film had all kinds of great things happen to them because specifically of the success of the Dirty Dozen.
It's interesting you say that because my next question involves the cast more at large, and the fact that this was a who's who of up and coming and past big name stars. Was this a movie that would have been considered a prestige film, something that people wanted to be in at the time, or do we just look back at it and say, wow, look at that cast?
Yes, it was a prestige film. It had a huge budget, and as big as the budget was, it went way over budget. It also had a lengthy shooting schedule, and it went way over that for a myriad of reasons. But in terms of being in it, oh yeah, anybody that was ultimately involved in the film was dying to be in it. They could not. Probably the sole exception was John Cassavetes. As great as he was in the movie, he didn't want to do it. He kind of was forced into it because he was being he had been blacklisted, which is a whole story that I go into in the book that kept him from being in any films for a couple of years. And Ken Hyman approached him to do The Dirty Dozen. And as Ken Hyman said to me, he goes, John Cassavetes was a great director, very good writer, wonderful actor, but he was also a great big pain in the ass. And he basically had to, he said he almost got in a fist fight with Cassavetes to get him to play the role. Cassavetes was making his own film at the time, and he ran out of money. He couldn't do post-production. He couldn't afford the lab and all that was involved and the editing facilities. So Ken Hyman said, look, John, why don't you do The Dirty Dozen, take the money from The Dirty Dozen and use it to finish your film? And so Cassavetes eventually relented. And luckily for him, he got along wonderfully with Robert Aldrich. He said Robert Aldrich was probably the most inventive, creative director he had ever worked with. And he did exactly as Hyman suggested. He took the money from The Dirty Dozen. By the way, when they were shooting the movie in England during the day, Cassavetes at night was working on the film he was trying to make. And every now and again, he joined the other cast members in the pubs and caroused a little bit. But what wound up happening was after the Dirty Dozen was done shooting, he finished his film. It was called Faces, which is considered an independent film classic. And consequently, it created a method in which Cassavetes lived the rest of his life. He would do a movie for money and take that money to make his own film. He did it to make all the films that he made, and it included having to be in movies like Rosemary's Baby, which he hated because he didn't get along with Roman Polanski, and a bunch of other films. He even made a biker film. But it resulted in him being considered the father of American independent cinema. He made, A Woman Under the Influence, Opening Night, his last film, Streamers, and just, no, Love Streams, excuse me. Just a wonderful, wonderful filmmaker. And by the way, he's the only one in The Dirty Dozen of the cast to get an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. And ironically, he lost the Oscar to George Kennedy, who won for Cool Hand Luke. And I say ironic because George Kennedy was in the cast of The Dirty Dozen.
And, I was just going to say that, the film was nominated for 4 Academy Awards.
Right.
Cassavetes was the only cast member nominated for his performance.
Right.
But let's talk a little bit more about some of the other actors that I haven't mentioned at this point. There's so many of them that jump off the screen at you in the film. Could you just comment a little bit about some of the other cast members and some of the things that you found interesting, particularly in working on this book?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I was lucky enough to interview Donald Sutherland, and he desperately wanted to be in the movie, and he did something very interesting. He had just appeared on an episode of the show on the BBC called The Saint with Roger Moore, and because he had an interesting scene in it, that particular episode was produced and directed by Roger Moore. He begged Roger Moore to get a copy of that episode to director Robert Aldrich, and he did. Aldrich saw it. Donald Sutherland got cast. In the same instance, when the film was over, a year or two later, actually less than that, because it took a long time in pre-production, Robert Altman was about to direct the movie MASH. And Donald Sutherland's agent approached Altman about playing the character of Hawkeye, and Altman said, "I don't know if he can do comedy or not. He's a very good actor, but comedy is kind of specific, especially this kind of comedy, black comedy." So Donald Sutherland told his agent, "Send Altman the Dirty Dozen. Let him see that, and then he could tell for himself." Well, Altman saw it and said, "Okay, Donald, you can play Hawkeye Pierce." And of course, his career took off from there. So, that's how much people wanted to be in it. And that was another example of the effect it had on people's careers. Anybody else you want to? Oh, and that's another thing, what Donald Sutherland did. In the movie, that great scene that he had, that standout scene where he's supposed to be a general inspecting the troops and he's hysterical in that scene. Okay. That wasn't written for him. That was supposed to be Clint Walker. And during the table read, Clint Walker really didn't want to play it. Because his character was supposed to be Native American, which they mentioned in passing in the film, and he thought it would denigrate Native Americans. He thought it would be a negative impact. And Donald Sutherland told me the story about how once Clint Walker passed on it, at the table read, Robert Aldridge is at the head of the table, and he looked down the table, saw Sutherland, and said, "Hey, you with the big ears, you do it." And Donald Sutherland went, "Yeah, well, I've always kind of had big ears," and that's how he got the part. I mean, that scene.
And that is a great scene.
Yeah, and he makes the best of it. It's great. I love it when he turns his head and looks at the rest of the dozen and sticks his tongue out. It's hysterical. He's great.
And that Cheshire cat look on his face when
Right?
he's inspecting the troops, and he dismisses where that one soldier's hometown is from. He is hilarious.
"Where you from, son?" "Madison City, Missouri, sir." And he goes, "Never heard of it."
Yep, exactly.
I love that.
Exactly. You mentioned a little bit about Robert Aldrich, but I wonder if you would, let's talk a little bit more about him before we get into the production of the film. Tell us a little bit more about where he came from and his filmography that might have led him up to this.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, he's from a very wealthy, not just wealthy, a very what's the word I'm looking for? Important, proud family from Rhode Island. He had a distant relative that was a member of Congress, and like I said, his cousin is Nelson Rockefeller, and a bunch of things like that. But in any event, he wanted to be a football player. He played football in college, but he injured his knee, which kept him out of the war, by the way. And his love of football was apparent in films like The Longest Yard, which he directed, which, by the way, makes for a very interesting double feature if you consider The Dirty Dozen. Once again, it's the prisoners playing against the guards. So there you have another. And of course, the authority in that movie, the warden, played by Eddie Albert, is unscrupulous and corrupt. That's how Aldridge saw the world. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about Robert Aldridge. It's often believed that Aldridge didn't get an Oscar nomination for The Dirty Dozen because of the end of the film being so violent and graphic. Ken Hyman told me that's just not true. He had heard that for years himself. He goes, he didn't get an Academy Award nomination for The Dirty Dozen, not because The Dirty Dozen was so violent, but because the Hollywood establishment didn't like didn't like Robert Aldridge, and Robert Aldridge didn't like the Hollywood establishment. He once famously said, if I made a biblical epic, I wouldn't get an Oscar nomination. Because those movies always get Oscar nominations. Well, actually, he did make a biblical epic. Unfortunately, it was Sodom and Gomorrah. So, that's not going to get an Oscar nomination. Now, it was an incredible year for film in 1967. And, Cool Hand Luke, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, In the Heat of the Night. It was a major sea change in filmmaking from 67 on. But it began in 67. Now, the movies I just mentioned all got Best Picture nominations, okay? The Dirty Dozen not only didn't get a Best Picture nomination or Best Director, but Dr. Dolittle did. Now, Dr. Dolittle was probably, at the time, one of the more famous bombs of all time. There are, of course, many others, but that was one of them. The very fact that it got a Best Picture nomination was basically the Hollywood establishment thumbing their nose at Robert Aldrich. Now, what I think is interesting is that many European critics and filmmakers appreciated Aldrich long before American critics and filmmakers did, much like they did with Sam Fuller, who is a god in Europe, and Don Siegel. There were several American filmmakers that were appreciated more overseas than they were in their own country. And when it came to the kind of films Aldrich made, he once he established himself, he was a product of the studio, so he often did a lot of things he didn't want to do, but he did it to make a reputation. But he directed Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Flight of the Phoenix, Attack, great movie, The Big Knife, about corruption in Hollywood. Oh my gosh, so many wonderful, wonderful films. And they were not the kinds of films that Hollywood liked. Audiences did, but Hollywood didn't. And the proof that he could have gotten the nomination for The Dirty Dozen, of the 4 nominations the film got, the Oscar it won was for best sound effects. Now, if Hollywood was so against the graphic violence of the film, why would it get an Oscar for the sound effects? Go figure that. Another example of a director like that is Sam Peckinpah, by the way. Peckinpah never got an Oscar nomination either, although he made some of the greatest and most violent films ever made. So that's where he came from, Aldrich.
We have a couple of participant questions, one of which I'm going to hold for just a couple minutes. But one of the questions involves, as you worked on the book, did you get a sense of how much of the film might have been ad-libbed, or was they pretty adhered closely to the script?
Oh, well, the great thing about Robert Aldrich was, unlike a lot of other directors, he likes to give his players a lot of rehearsal time, and both not just on location when they're shooting, but before they even began shooting, in the soundstage at what I believe it was Boreham Studios in London. He took a soundstage and he got this huge table, and he got all the entire cast seated around the table, and every cast member had a bound leather copy of the script, and they would go through it. And at the table is when they would tweak things, change things. And like the example I used before about Clint Walker and Donald Sutherland, Cassavetes famously said that when they were going through what was to be said and what was to be done, he said, what I liked about Aldrich was he allowed me to do whatever I wanted. He said, if there was something to be done and nobody wanted to do it, I'd immediately raise my hand and go, I'll do it. And he goes, the other cast members would grumble and say some epithets under their breath, but Cassavetes was always willing to do anything to get more screen time, and he did. And Ken Hyman said that on the very first day of rehearsal, he goes, I was amazed to see how these actors who really, they're actors, but they really don't have anything in common. They all have divergent backgrounds. They all come from different places. But on the very first day, you saw them begin to gel. They bonded. And he said, I saw the dozen come together on day one. And then it just got more and more intense. And a couple of times there were some run-ins about, how things should be done. But for the most part, once it was understood how it was to be played, then they went and started shooting. But even while they were shooting, they would do little things my favorite example is what the script, the continuity script girl said about how every time a scene was going to be shot, just before they said action, she would check all the actors to make sure they were wearing their uniform the same way as they had in the previous shot. And she goes, and it was always Cassavetes who had his coat open a little bit more or his collar open more, because he was set, to her mind, he was just a troublemaker, but he was actually just having fun with her. And Jim Brown said that Cassavetes was a wonderment. He said he was the mentor of the cast. He was like a natural teacher. He goes, if he came to the set feeling kind of moody, then the character he played, Franco, was moody, and all of us were moody. If he came to the set feeling playful, Franco was playful, and the cast was playful. That was the effect he had on everybody. And so a lot of what you saw in film, especially the little touches, that was added by the actors. One of my favorite examples, real quick, and it's not in the script, early on when they're lining up and they're in the training area they're supposed to be in, and you hear Richard Jaco say, "All right, Franco, put out that cigarette," and you see Cassavetes lift his arm real high and then toss it. It's like he has to let everybody know I'm putting the cigarette out, right? Little things like that. That's what a very good actor does.
So, as I recall from reading your book, I think it was Robert Aldrich who was interested in the rights to the book before it actually had been published, and
Correct.
they only got the rights after it became a bestseller.
Right.
So, to me, when I think about something like that, adapting a book in itself is a challenge, but adapting a book that's a best-selling book is even more so. Can you talk a little bit about how Nunnally Johnson and Lucas Heller adapted it, and what significant changes they may have made to the Nathanson book?
Sure. Actually, by the time Nunnally Johnson was assigned to write the screenplay, he was, there were already about 4 or 5 drafts, and MGM had spent an exorbitant amount of money on writers, because before Ken Hyman was assigned the project, they had another producer and another director and another writer, and unfortunately, there was or fortunately, depending on one's point of view, there was a schedule conflict, and those people had to leave the project. It was a director and producer named George Seaton, who had directed The Bridges at Toko-Ri, but he's more famous for directing Miracle on 34th Street, and later Airport. But in any event, and he had a screenwriter he was a partner with. I believe his name was Henry Denker, or maybe Kurlberg was the producer. I get confused sometimes. But in any event, also Mick Nathanson took a shot at the screenplay, and it was all turned down by when Ken Hyman came on, and he was friends with Nunnally Johnson, and he assigned him to do the screenplay. The head of MGM didn't really want Nunnally Johnson to write it, because he thought of Nunnally Johnson as the guy who wrote How to Marry a Millionaire, which he did, and several other comedies and musical comedies. And Ken Hyman told him, "Yeah, well, he also wrote Grapes of Wrath, won the Oscar for it, and that's a real yacht fest, isn't it?" So he convinced the head of MGM. Now, when Nunnally Johnson wrote it, Robert Aldrich was by that time hired and read the script. And as he told Ken Hyman, he said, "Look, this is a very good script for 1945. This movie's going to come out in 1967, and this screenplay is not a 1967 screenplay." As he put it, it was an interesting analogy. He said that, in the 40s, war was ice cream. Now, war is cancer. We're dealing with cancer. So he decided to have Robert Aldrich, like all great directors, had a group of men that he would always work with. John Ford did that. You name it. All the great directors did that. Capra. And he had a kind of a stock writer named Lucas Heller. Lucas Heller had wrote the screenplay for Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and Flight of the Phoenix. So he brought in Lucas Heller to do a rewrite. And not Lucas Heller, excuse me. And when Nunnally Johnson heard that Lucas Heller was going to rewrite the script, he got very upset. He didn't want Lucas Heller's name on the script at all. He went to the WGA, which is, of course, not very much in the news, for arbitration to get his name taken off the script. And he lost that fight. So that's why they both get co-screenwriting credit. And Lucas Heller was asked years later if he ever saw the film. And he said, "No, I never have, and I never will." Because having somebody else be given co-writing credit, he goes, it's like being a nervous father, an expectant father, and not really sure if you're the father or not. So that was his take on it. Now, what was changed from the book was a lot. Now, I've gotten some flack from some reviewers, actually not any professional reviewers, but mainly reviewers on like Amazon and Goodreads and other websites, that I spent too much time summarizing the novel. Well, the reason I did that was so people could see the difference between the novel and the movie. And there are major, major differences. One of the things that was changed, well, there were several female characters that Nathanson had written. There were more than two or three. They were all taken out. In one version, Lucas Heller wrote, one of them was still in it, but then ultimately he did like 3 or 4 revisions, and ultimately she was taken out. It's a character named Lady Margot, who is a very important character in the novel. She's a very rich woman who owns the land that the dozen are training on, and nobody's supposed to know that they're there. Now, she's also having an affair with Robert Ryan's character, Colonel Breed, which is how Robert Ryan finds out where they're training, because Lady Margot tells him. Now, that was all taken out. And also there was a character named Tess, who works at a London pub. She's a barmaid, and she has an affair with Lee Marvin's character. That was completely taken out for reasons of censorship. And there were some other things. There was a whole huge section in the novel, and also in one version of the screenplay, wherein at the training, the parachute school that Robert Ryan runs, there were a bunch of incidences where Robert Ryan's character and Lee Marvin's character confront each other and conflict, and that was all taken out, all of it. The only thing that was left in, which actually Aldrich didn't want to do, but they left it in anyway, was the scene where Charles Bronson goes to the latrine and 2 of Robert Ryan's men beat him up. But that's left in. But my favorite example of one of the biggest changes in the novel, there were 3 different characters of the dozen. That one was a bigot, a Southern bigot, another was a psychosexual maniac, and another was a religious fanatic. Those 3 characters were made one character, played by Telly Savalas, which I find fascinating. And he made it believable that these 3 different personas are all in one guy. And you can believe it the way he plays it. It's amazing. So that's another big change.
So before I'm moving toward the end of the plot and the end of the film, but as we go there, let's talk a little bit about the production and the sets and the elaborate amount of money that was probably spent on the production at the end, with the on location shooting and that sort of thing. Can you talk a little bit about that and what kind of challenges that they faced and what sort of opportunities it afforded them?
Sure. As I said, the movie went over schedule and over budget, and one of the reasons was that the weather didn't cooperate. It would, they'd get all the way to the location area, and it would start raining, and they would sit around and wait. As Trini Lopez said, they called it the bloody rain. It just always rained. Now, that aside, there was also the issue of the thing that you mentioned a moment ago, the production. Robert Aldrich was getting very upset about the amount of time it took to construct the chateau. And the chateau was enormous, and everything they did was incredible. When you see it in the movie, it's all made just for the film. That scene when they first come to the chateau and you hear, they're coming up over the hill and you see the chateau, and and the soundtrack is playing Deutschland über alles, and it's a towering thing, huge. And the facade is almost all real, completely real. They also built a lake and a moat, just all kinds of stuff. And they did such a good job, and it took so long that the special effects department discovered it would have taken 200 tons of explosives to blow up the chateau. Well, that's just a little much. So, much to Robert Aldrich's regret, he knew they had to disassemble part of the chateau and reassemble it with like balsa wood and styrofoam and things that were more accessible to dynamite. And they did do that, and they wound up using 20 tons instead of 200 tons. But it still took a long time. Another problem was, because of the way the laws worked in England, he couldn't use his regular crew. He had his regular cinematographer, a guy named Joe Byrock, Oscar winner, whom I interviewed a while back because he's since passed away, and several other people that he couldn't use. And he had to use a cinematographer by the name of Edward Scaife, who, when John Huston made his films like The African Queen and several others out of the United States, Scaife worked with Huston. So Aldrich figured I might as well work with a guy who's used to working with American film directors. Unfortunately, he still took his time. Aldrich was used to doing like 20 or 30 shots a day, setups a day. The British crews would take so much time they would get like 2 or 3 shots a day, setups a day. Drove him nuts. He couldn't stand it. He was very frustrated by that. So those were some of the, problems and challenges, for lack of a better word, that Aldrich encountered.
We talked about authenticity, and that is one of the things that another question we have is, and we're starting to talk about blowing up things too. You mentioned blowing up the chateau. The question is, did they destroy an original Volkswagen Kubenwagen in that end sequence? So were they destroying vintage World War II vehicles as part of that?
That's it's interesting. That's one of the things they used in the promotion. They made a making of short called, excuse me, Operation Dirty Dozen. And the guy doing the narration mentions that hundreds of vintage World War II vehicles were brought in at no expense was too great. And no, they didn't. They just didn't do that. What they did was they refitted existing vehicles. And there's a gentleman by the name of Dale Dye. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not. He is he was a combat veteran in Vietnam and I believe Iraq too, who is a military advisor, a technical advisor on war films now. He was the advisor on Saving Private Ryan and Platoon and a bunch of other great movies. And in the DVD commentary for The Dirty Dozen, he says, I really love this movie. It's a great film, but they got so many things wrong in terms of the the equipment they used. And he was very specific about the vehicles, the weaponry, even the uniforms that just were not accurate. He said the filmmakers obviously figured, as long as it looks military, let's just keep shooting the movie. They weren't, and he wasn't the only one to say that. I interviewed a gentleman, a British gentleman who is now a legendary stuntman, but at the time, his name is Jim Dowdle. But at the time, he was the armorer for the film. And he winced watching the movie, knowing that they did not use anything vintage. But he told a wonderful story about teaching both Bronson and Marvin how to use an M1, which was called the grease gun. And Bronson was not a lot of fun during the making of the movie. He was very moody. And he told Dowdle, he said, yeah, I know how to shoot a gun, so piss off, kid. Now, Marvin did something even better. He went to Marvin's trailer and he's showing him how to disassemble and assemble an M1 and how to shoot it if need be, which of course they did. But while he's telling him all this, he said, Marvin, it was early in the morning and Marvin was smoking a cigarette, didn't look up at me much while I was talking, but he just kept going, yeah. And he also had an almost empty bottle of Jack Daniels that he was drinking from. And it was like 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. And he goes, and when I was done, Jim Dowdle said, I said, do you understand everything I just told you? And Marvin goes, yeah, let me get this straight. And he took the gun from Dowdle, the rifle, never looked at it, just kept looking at Dowdle, took the whole thing apart without looking at the rifle, staring at Jim Dowdle, I'm sorry, and then put it back together again. And then he goes, is that how you wanted me to do it? And Jim Dowdle said, what a schmuck I was. I had no idea that Marvin had been a combat veteran. And he goes, and that's how I found out. And it was amazing to see him do that. So anyway, that's just one of the stories about the equipment that was used.
So just a reminder, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. I want to talk a little bit about the ending. There's no way around it. The finale is violent, and I would consider it even violent by today's standards.
Yep.
Do you think that the depiction of violence is trying to convey a message, or was it just there to move the plot to its end?
Yeah, we talked about this briefly before we went live. And as I said at the time, I think the answer is both. It did indeed create a powerful finale, and it was making a statement. As I said earlier, Lee Marvin had no problem with that. And also that ending, it was several of the characters in the movie when there was a character named Pinkley was Donald Sutherland. He was dead. There's a character named Vladek who was shot between the eyes by a sniper, and they're dead. And when Lee Marvin shouts at Richard Jekyll, excuse me, the MP, and says, "Find some gasoline," and Jekyll goes, "Gasoline? Are you sure?" And Marvin shouts at him, "You want to ask Pinkley and Vladek? Now get going." So it was Aldrich's way of saying, they've killed us, we're going to kill them. And that is also called warfare. And that, I think, is the point that was being made. And early on, Bronson, once they're locked into the wine cellar or basement, Bronson says to Marvin, joking, "You didn't think of that, did you?" And Marvin said, "They got to breathe, don't they?" And so they find the ventilation thingies, the ventilators, and they take them off, and they dump gasoline down there. Now, a lot of people were upset by that, but also, too, Aldrich was making a statement with that the gasoline and the hand grenade, which, by the way, it doesn't detonate gas. It just doesn't. But that's okay. It was a point being made in the film. They were meant to be symbolic and metaphorical of the Holocaust and what the Nazis did to the Jews. Also, too, during the Vietnam War, the use of napalm, and it was symbolic of that. And there was a statement being made there that this is what war does, and this is what war has always done. They kill, the enemy and the innocent alike. Everybody does it.
So, I'm thinking about the film's legacy, and I know Quentin Tarantino and James Gunn both reference The Dirty Dozen, but I'm also thinking about their style of movie and pacing and how it's constructed and so on and so forth. Do you think that The Dirty Dozen is an accessible movie for today's audience?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. I don't really think it's, I don't know how one defines a movie that might be dated other than the dialogue that might be, archaic or ancient, or maybe the certain situations, what have you. But in either case, that doesn't affect The Dirty Dozen. Both the dialogue and even the costuming and the scenes are, it could be from today. Other than the quality of the given film stock, which I know is minor, it's not, to my mind, it's not dated whatsoever. So I think it would last today. Now, it's interesting when they made Saving Private Ryan, which is an amazing film. I can't believe somebody told me recently that it's been 25 years since that came out. That blew me away. I didn't know it had been that long. But Spielberg at the time, who directed it, he kind of trashed The Dirty Dozen, saying that my movie's not anything like The Dirty Dozen, and that was just a gung-ho war film. Well, actually, no, it wasn't, but that's Spielberg. And the opening of Saving Private Ryan is one of the most powerful things I've ever seen in a movie. The first 10 minutes of the film, when they land on the beach at Normandy, and it's done in a way that I've never seen. And in much the same way that The Dirty Dozen enraged people when they consider the fact that when the chateau blew up, innocent people were killed, Spielberg did the same kind of thing once they got past the beach. And there were several Germans who were wanting to surrender, and they put up white flags and they put up their arms. And Spielberg had his characters kill those Germans. They shot them. And Spielberg said during the time the film came out that actually happened. That was real. And there were several film critics who wrote about that, saying that that's taking the all-American GI and making him a war criminal. Well, people on both sides do terrible things. It's war. And that was the point Spielberg was trying to make, despite the fact that he dissed The Dirty Dozen. He created similar controversy himself.
So, for those who haven't seen the movie or haven't seen it recently, do you have any parting thoughts on what viewers might find most interesting, or you would encourage them to look for when they watch the film?
Sure. Gosh, there's several. I got friends of mine who said, "I'm going to rewatch the movie and then read your book." And I said, "Do me a favor, read the book first, then watch the movie, because then you'll be able to see things you didn't know existed." One of my favorite examples was the thing that Clint Walker told me. I interviewed Walker, that the night before they shot the scene where Lee Marvin goads him into stabbing him with a knife, The night before, Clint Walker had cut his thumb, and took like 12 stitches in it because he was making himself something to eat, and slipped and sliced his finger. And when they were rehearsing the scene the next day, he kept his thumb out, Clint Walker, so it wouldn't get damaged or anything. And when they were rehearsing it, Robert Aldridge was walking him through it, and he kept grabbing him by the thumb. And Clint Walker would wince, but he didn't say anything. And then Lee Marvin was the one who went, Bob. And finally, Aldridge goes, Lee, what is it? And Marvin went, Clint cut his thumb last night. And that's when Aldridge was like, oh, geez, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Anyway, with that in mind, it's a minor example, but when you watch the scene and you see Clint Walker holding the scabbard, and then Marvin pulls the knife out, if you're watching it on DVD or freeze frame it, you see this great big black gash on Clint Walker's thumb, which you wouldn't know to look for if you hadn't read the book. And there are several other things like that. One of my favorites was just before Jim Brown did that great scene where he runs and dumps all the grenades. Just before they were going to shoot that, Jim Brown turned to Robert Aldridge and said, let me shoot a Nazi. and Aldridge was like, you're going to kill hundreds of Nazis. What do you want to kill a Nazi for? And Jim Brown went, oh, come on, let me do it. It'll be cool. And so Robert Aldridge was like, all right, fine. You get to kill a Nazi. So just before he throws those hand grenades, he gets shot at by a sniper, and he takes his M1 and he fires at him, and you see the guy fall through the glass. And so Jim Brown got to shoot a Nazi. And, things like that. That's what you want to look for.
That's great. Well, Dwayne, I want to thank you for taking time to talk about your new book, Killin Generals, which focuses on the making of the Dirty Dozen. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, my pleasure. I thought, are we not going to take questions from anybody, or?
We don't normally do it via audio. I've been trying to encourage them throughout. I'll make the call one more time. Does anybody have any questions? They've been awfully quiet today.
I'm seeing. Okay. Did they destroy an original VW Cuba wagon action escape scene towards the climax of the film? To my mind, in answer to that question, no. Several of the things that were that were used in the film, several vehicles, nobody even knew what they were. When Dale Dye was doing the commentary, and that weird thing that one of the Nazis rides up in, it's like a motorized scooter, and it has this big armor plate in the front, and he's shooting from it. Dale Dye said, I don't even know what the hell that is. What is that thing? So they really, like I said, they really didn't go out of their way to be realistic in the vehicles they used.
We had a comment saying they were really impressed with the wide breadth of film history and saying this was awesome. So, this is a great one. What current war films would you recommend?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. This is a terrible thing to say. I'm a huge movie fan, have been my whole life. And with that in mind, I have never, ever been bothered by graphic violence, nudity, obscenity, vulgar language. Doesn't bother me. It really doesn't. Many times I figure it sometimes, makes a given film better. Those several things I mentioned. However, I haven't been to the movies on a regular basis in a very long time. I am just not a fan of contemporary filmmaking. So when asked what current war films can you recommend, I can't really say because I haven't seen any contemporary or current war film. I can, on the other hand, tell you some of my favorite war films overall. One of them being the one I mentioned a moment ago, Saving Private Ryan. I find that an amazing piece of filmmaking. And of course, I have favorites. It's not necessarily a great film, but it's a film I love watching, and I'll watch it anytime. It drives my girlfriend crazy. A movie called Von Ryan's Express with Frank Sinatra. Love that movie. The Longest Day. Gosh, so many wonderful films. Those are the movies, if you haven't seen, I would highly recommend. One of the movies that I know a lot of people like to talk about and recommend from that same time period was Where Eagles Dare. And I don't particularly care for that film. I think it's over the top. I think it's obvious. And I could have guessed who the bad guy was from the first 10 minutes of the film. So I found it way too long. And I've never, ever been, as much as I love movies, I've never been a Clint Eastwood fan, ever. I find him dull, but that's me. In fact, at the time he was making it big, I love that Life magazine said he went to the Mount Rushmore School of Acting, and I happen to agree with that. But yeah, there were a lot, to my mind, there were a lot of classic war films. Oh, I'll tell you one, and once again, it's been a while since it came out. The one that Tarantino directed, Inglourious Bastard. That's a lot of fun. I like that movie a lot, and I'm a huge Tarantino fan. And there's an example because there's no Tarantino movie that doesn't have a lot of violence, but I think he's a very inventive and creative filmmaker. So yeah, there you go.
Well, thank you. And I do appreciate you taking time to talk to us about your book. Thank you again. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us in. We've been talking with Dwayne Epstein. He is the author of Killin Generals. Thank you, Dwayne.
Oh, thank you, Michael. I had a wonderful time. Thank you for letting me blather on.
No, it's been wonderful. We appreciate the insight. Thank you.
Cool.